listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the honor of interviewing Vivien Sieber. Vivien is the author of the book Kino and Kinder, which is about her family's history during World War II and the Holocaust. The interview in this episode was recorded prior to the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas on a music festival in Israel and the start of the currently ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. I'm here with Vivien Sieber, who is the author of the book Kino and Kinder. Vivien, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, I'm Vivien Sieber. I live in Oxford, UK. I'm the daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And when I had a day job, I trained as a biologist. So I'm a geneticist who I did bioscience research for a number of years at UK universities. Then I moved into teaching and taught genetics. And then I moved into education development and learning technology and information literacy. And since I've retired, I've written Kino and Kinder, and I'm learning to make pots.
Now, without spoiling too much of Kino and Kinder, what is your book about?
It's about my family and many of the people they interacted with on the way. So it starts about 1880 with my great-great-grandparents, and it ends in 2020 with me getting Austrian nationality.
Is Kino and Kinder self-published, traditionally published, or published through a hybrid press?
It's a hybrid via Eye2Eye Publishing, Manchester.
Manchester, England.
Yes.
Now, do you have any tips or advice for anyone who is thinking about writing their own book?
Yes, be really, really organised. I'm very lucky that I've worked with librarians for the last 10 years of my working career. So I've learnt a lot about finding and organising information. And so what I would suggest to anybody thinking about doing a book is the things that I didn't do perhaps carefully enough is how are you going to organise the information, and how are you going to, for example, references. I used Reference Manager. I used EndNote because that's what I'm used to using. I'm an advanced user of Word, so I did it all in Word styles. And because there are a lot of pictures in my book, of course the file size got very big. So it's really important I wrote it as chapters that were separate units, just so that my computer didn't die every time.
As there are a lot of books, both fiction and nonfiction, that are written about or set in the World War II era, why is your book unique?
Well, it's unique because unlike many, yes, it is a family history in that it starts in 1880 Brno, which was the capital of Moravia in Czechoslovakia, and it runs through. It follows the chronology, but it runs through very briefly, the First World War, the Second World War II, and the awful events of the Holocaust. But it's following it in relation to my grandmother and the cinema she had in Vienna, and my father, and their flights to England. My father was the first enemy alien to serve in the Royal Navy, so we've then got bits about naval intelligence, and it runs right through to what happened to the cinema through the war and after the war, and my grandmother's fight to get it back. So you've got history spanning it, which of course is from a European perspective, and then you've got how the history of these events actually affected individuals. And it's based on quite a lot of historical research. So I've got papers from the archives, the Vienna archives, which told me a great deal about what happened to the cinema once the Nazis confiscated it. the same time, my grandmother was a matron in a hostel for girls saved on the Kinder transport, first in Tynemouth, which is northeast England near Newcastle, and then in Windermere. And it's got reminiscences and reflections from the children who were taken away from their parents as very young children and moved from Germany and Austria and one poor Czech girl to England, where of course they spoke no language and they were left, separated from their families. And they talk about that in letters and interviews. I think this experience and what happened to them in the end. Now, there are many Holocaust stories where you get the devastation of entire families lost, but at least with my book, you get the survivors go on to lead fulfilling and useful lives, and talk about that. So to some extent, that's another reason why it's different. So it's not just one family; it's lots of people who they've encounter on the way.
Now, your book is about your family history and the histories of other families in World War II and the Holocaust. How is this relevant today, especially with anti-Semitism on the rise in a lot of the world?
Well, I think that's very, very relevant, and you've just said why it's so relevant. We can see from Kino and Kinder and other books about the Holocaust how rapidly conditions deteriorated for Jews and how rapidly they were persecuted. Now it's very you lose the sort of freedom of democracy was destroyed in a matter of 10 years, and we're already seeing dangers of lurching to the far right, certainly in Britain and across Europe and in America with Trump. At the same time, you've got lurch with Putin to an extreme government where people have lost their freedom. And, of course, where you've now got war with another country. So I think we can't forget what happened in the 20th century, and hopefully it can inform the 21st.
Yeah, and you mentioned how the scary parallels between anti-Semitism today and the rise of Hitler and the Nazis in 1930s Germany. That just makes the rise of anti-Semitism in the Western world that much more scarier.
Yes, I think you have to remember that anti-Semitism didn't just start in the 1930s. That there have been examples of anti-Semitism through the 18th and 19th century, where Jews were the successive pogroms across Europe, well, far Europe, like Russia and Latvia and places like that, and which forced a lot of Jews to migrate towards the West. So you've got the Jewish population moving into Vienna and places like that. It certainly got concentrated in Vienna. In Germany, only about 1% of the population was Jewish, and most Germans would never have actually met a Jew, which makes what happened with National Socialism even more scary in some ways. So, yes, anti-Semitism is an old thing, yes, and it's bubbling away and it's increasing, but possibly that's because societies are becoming less and less tolerant now.
How can people in either the United Kingdom or the United States buy your book?
It's available in any bookshop to be ordered, or you can get it on Amazon or Book Depository, or any of the online vendors, really, or local bookshops.
In addition to your work as an author, you've written approximately 100 academic papers. What are some topics you've written academic papers about?
Well, I've written my first tranche of papers was on hybridization in wild species of grass from a population genetics point of view. So that was my PhD. Then I went on and postdoced, and I looked at the effects of radiation on skin. And there we were trying to see when you irradiate a patient, you're trying to spare the normal tissues because obviously you want the radiation. This is a long time ago and it's changed now, but the radiation will cause burning to skin, and you need to get it to the tumour. So I was working in the radiobiology research group in Oxford, and I was actually growing culture. I was growing skin, and as a cell model for doing that, and I'm looking at the effect of radiation on pig hairs. And then I moved to London and started making actually cultured composite skin, which we put onto which we put onto patients. So that was making growing skin in the laboratory that you could then use clinically. And the rest were botany, plant genetics papers. Oh, and information literacy and e-learning. So then I moved into what you need to do to get somebody else to use technology in their teaching. So there are quite a lot of papers like that about that.
Now, how and where were those academic papers published?
Right, the science ones were all done conventionally through the peer review process, often in prestigious journals. So that's a standard. You submit your paper. It's reviewed generally by two people, and they either accept it or reject it, and they make may ask for corrections, which you make, and they agree you've done it right. The e-learning and the more the more learning and teaching ones, they were more chapters or invited chapters in books or symposia or something like that. Again, there would have been a review process.
Vivien, you were a wonderful guest for this podcast, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you very much.
I have a major announcement to make. Effective early next year, this podcast will no longer be called the Heartland Author Podcast. This podcast will continue to be known as the Heartland Author Podcast until the end of the 6th and current season in mid-December, and when this podcast returns from winter break in mid-January for the 7th season, this podcast will be renamed Apollo Papyrus. I have already updated the Spotify for Podcasters URL to reflect the upcoming name change of this podcast. Additionally, the Heartland Author channel on YouTube, which this podcast was originally intended as a side project of, will be shut down after the final 2 videos are uploaded to the Heartland Author channel next month. Unlike the podcast, where the Apollo Papyrus podcast will retain the history of the Heartland Author podcast, the new Apollo Papyrus YouTube channel launching in February will be a completely new YouTube channel. The reason I have decided to drop the Heartland Author branding after this year is that I interview a lot of guests on here who are not from the Midwestern United States, and the Heartland Author branding is too regional for the broader audience of this podcast. I am still a proud and lifelong Midwesterner, and I look forward to interviewing authors from across America and around the world. I also look forward to finishing this season of the Heartland Author Podcast in the future after the rebranding from the Heartland Author Podcast to Apollo Papyrus. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACScribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.